I met our next presenter at the IFEBP Health and Wellness Conference last February in Savannah, Georgia, which is where I was first introduced to an earlier version of the presentation you're going to see today. I found her presentation to be very sobering, enlightening in light of the fact that while we were in Savannah, I was eating massive quantities of Deep South food. There is something to be said about eating a 32-ounce meatloaf deep fried in beer, but that's just what they do down there. So Desiree is a registered dietitian and nutrition consultant from Vancouver who advocates that good food is a cornerstone of a lifestyle that prevents chronic disease, promotes energy, vitality, and overall well-being. The CSBT has become a huge fan of her work, and we're lucky to have her here. Please welcome Desiree Nielsen.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. This is always the worst. They bring in the dietitian to tell you how everything's bad for you right before lunch. I apologize, but I'm sure there's going to be a delicious and healthy lunch. So this presentation might be a little bit different from some of the other nutrition presentations you might have seen, because we're going to talk about good, healthy food and what that actually is. But for me as a dietitian, what I've found in my career is that dietitians can often talk about the sodium or the fat or the calories that you should be taking in, what to avoid, what to eat. And most of you already know that. Instinctively, you know that you should pick up an apple instead of a bag of potato chips. And you still reach for the potato chips. So for me, what I find really fascinating is to talk a little bit more about the why. The why, the what, the how of what's going on in our society, what's going on in our country to make us, encourage us to make the food choices that we are making. And so that's what today is about a little bit more. So we're going to talk today a little bit more about how our food supply itself has changed. So a lot of the foods that we've been buying for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or that even looks like the food that we grew up eating has actually changed dramatically in terms of its composition. And also the way that it's marketed to you. And that's had a dramatic impact on what our diets, what we actually put on our family table, looks like. We're going to talk about how these foods, these transformed foods, affect our metabolism and what that's actually doing to our health. So we're going to talk about another mitigating factor, which is the information that we consume on a daily basis. I'm a huge Twitter fan, from Twitter and Facebook and newspapers and television that are all sending us these very conflicting messages about what is good to eat, will lemons cure cancer tomorrow kind of deal. So we're going to talk about why this happens. And then we're going to have a little bit of fun about how the new evidence is actually challenging some long-held dictums in nutrition. And then just a few food rules at the end, because I do like to end with good news. And there is actually a lot of good news in this presentation, because I feel that knowledge is very empowering. So the more that you understand about why you make and how you make the choices you make, the more empowered you are to actually change some of those. So more and more in Canada, the picture of food is not really an apple or a piece of chicken. It's a big, fancy, colorful, shiny box. Our agricultural landscape has changed significantly over the last 100 years. And in fact, the family farm is in decline. The cost of large-scale agricultural operations essentially prices small farms, which was really our bread and butter for many, many decades in this country, right out of business. So agriculture is intensifying. It is becoming larger scale. It's changing the type of foods that we eat. And yet with all of this change and so many things becoming far more expensive in this world, we're actually spending less of our income on food than ever before in our history. And in Canada, we spend less of our income on food than any other country in the world, except the United States of America. And remarkably, within that quite small food budget, we can still afford to pay someone else to make our food for us. Restaurants, fast food, grab-and-go options at the grocery store are becoming more popular than ever as we choose to spend our time doing something else other than food preparation. And notice that I said choose to spend our time doing something else, because we're sold this cult of convenience, this idea that you have no time to cook. You have no time to make a healthy meal for your family. And yet somehow we have a lot of time to catch every episode of The Bachelor. Or Homes on Homes for the men in the crowd. You know, it is about a choice and about choosing to prioritize food and good food in your life and in your family's life. And time was, we didn't actually think that much. You know, we seem kind of nutrition and food and health obsessed now. And I think it speaks to where we've gotten as a society, that we are less healthy than we ever have been before. You know, time was, we didn't actually think that much about what went down our gullets. You know, whatever vegetables we grew, whatever animals we raised, we ate. That was it. And raising all that food was really hard work. So we ate heartily. We didn't worry about weight gain until maybe, you know, we got older and then the kids started taking over the farming. We started sitting around the farm a little bit more. So we gained a little bit of excess weight. But we're not eating those sorts of foods anymore. You know, things like flour and butter and sugar, those things are totally passé. You know, that's like totally 1942. Instead, we have modified milk ingredients and vital wheat gluten and sugars made out of corn and stabilizers made out of soy, and everything has to be low fat or sugar free or this free or that free. And what's left when you try and make a food that's free of everything? A whole bunch of industrialized food ingredients, like lecithin that's made from soy or maltodextrin that's made from corn. We're eating a lot of food that's not actually made of any food. And so this food processing, these, you know, wonderful advances in our industrialized food system have had a huge impact on our health. And we're not really talking about that an awful lot. So when I went to UBC to become a dietitian, one of the central tenets of good nutrition planning is variety. The reason for that is that each food has its own unique composition of nutrients. So the vitamins, the minerals, the phytochemicals, the fats, the proteins, each one has a different complex of those nutrients. And so if we're only eating a handful of foods, we're going to be lacking for one thing or another that nature intended us to be getting. And that's why this list is so concerning to me. So this list is the top 4 agricultural products in the United States, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. We have corn, soy, cow's milk, and wheat. And you might look at this and say, oh, well, you know, this might not apply to me. I only barbecue corn in the summer, and I certainly don't eat tofu, because who eats tofu? But I would challenge you when you go home this evening to actually look in your cupboards and start reading some ingredients lists, which to me as a dietitian is the most important thing you can look at on a food package. So you might notice that, well, corn, I don't think I have any corn in my cupboards, but look on a side dish. Look on a side dish or a snack food like a tortilla chip or a granola bar. And you might find the maltodextrin, which is a texturizer and a sweetener made from corn. On an ice cream or a cookie or even a granola bar, you might find some of that lecithin made from soy. You might find milk proteins, random milk proteins, not just in your milk and in your yogurt, but milk proteins in your breakfast cereal or in your bread, for example. And then wheat's pretty much in everything nowadays. We figured out how to break wheat into a million pieces and put it in absolutely everything, just like soy and corn. In Canada, we tend to fare a little bit differently. Our top 4 crops are maize and milk and wheat, and then we have rapeseed. So rapeseed is canola oil, right? And replacing soy is actually barley. You know, I wish I could say that you were all eating barley, but we actually give that to our animals. It's really sad to think that sometimes our animals are eating better than we are. So if you take those 4 foods, you know, the first being wheat, you think about wheat flour, probably one of the most staple foods or staple ingredients in our pantry. Besides bread, one of the biggest commodities that wheat flour is a part of is breakfast cereal. And it's amazing because you go to a grocery store and there's a whole aisle a whole aisle of breakfast cereals with different colored boxes and different shapes and maybe some marshmallows or a little bit of dried cranberry or raisins. There's seemingly endless varieties of breakfast cereals nowadays. But most of them share one central process, and that's that wheat flour is mixed with water into a paste, and then it's cooked into all these sorts of different shapes. And in scientific terms, we call that a pre-gelatinized starch. So we're going to talk about what that pre-gelatinized starch actually does to your blood sugar and your health a little bit later on. So doesn't that just suck the life out of it? My breakfast cereal is pre-gelatinized starch. So the next, if you take the wheat, you make it into breakfast cereal, you can take that corn and soy, which can be made into oils, which are very unsaturated and therefore liquid at room temperature. And someone in 1911 figured out that if you drive hydrogen molecules into it at very, very high pressure, you can solidify them. You can hydrogenate these fats and make this wonderful thing called shortening and margarine, filled with trans fats, which are quickly falling out of favor to anyone who reads a nutrition facts label. But to me, the creation of trans fats was a major leap forward in terms of food processing and our ability to manipulate food and the impact that it has on our health. So if you take the hydrogenated oils and the wheat flour and you add a little bit of beef and some potatoes, what do you get? The basics for a value meal. And although fast food didn't really change our culinary landscape until about the 1950s, the first fast food restaurant actually started in 1919. Can anyone guess what it was? Go ahead, shout out a guess. A&W, who said A&W? Gold Star. Yeah, A&W, first fast food restaurant in 1919. And they now have over 700 locations in Canada alone. And then finally, the last great leap that I think affects our metabolisms and our health, as much or more so than the lovely invention of wheat flour and all of its products, is actually the first commercial shipment of high fructose corn syrup, which was 1967. So there's a lot of controversy about high fructose corn syrup. And proponents of its health, or at least its neutrality, will tell you, well, it's just corn. It's just sugar made from corn. So high fructose corn syrup, does anyone actually know how it's made? Okay. So what you do is you take corn, wonderful corn with proteins and fiber and all of these wonderful nutrients, and then you mill it into a flour and turn it into syrup. So you cook it into syrup, which is pretty it's normal. Most of us have that lily white corn syrup that we or our parents or grandparents used to make candies out of. That's sugar, not too big of a deal. But they actually take that corn syrup and then they treat it with enzymes. And corn syrup is made of a sugar called glucose, which is actually the energy currency of our body. It's what our body knows how to run on. It even turns our bread and our potatoes into glucose so that we can run our bodies. It takes that glucose and it converts it into a sugar called fructose. Almost entirely, 100% fructose. And then they add back a little glucose, so it looks approximately like sugar on paper. It's about 55% of that fructose and 45% of that glucose. And so you say, well, it looks a lot like the white stuff, the normal white stuff. It's just like sugar that comes from corn. But in fact, we have a great amount of research that shows us that it's not just like corn, including a study that was published and publicized just this week, showing us that fructose actually increases appetite. You could get the same amount of calories from fructose as you do from glucose, and with the glucose, your brain will say, hey, I just had some food. I don't need to eat anymore. You have the fructose, it says, that's good, let's have some more. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how sugars affect our body in a minute. So this is my favorite thing, ice cream. Ice cream, ice cream always satisfies, right? Like there's, people like salty, sweet, all those kind of things. Most people love ice cream. And so I love ice cream. And what I noticed over the past 5 years is that ice cream is supposed to be made from cream and sugar, maybe a little bit of egg, maybe some vanilla, whatever other fruit you want to have in it. If you go to the grocery store and actually look on the ingredients labels of ice cream now, you will find, even if it has the 100% Canadian milk seal on the front, it is likely made from modified milk ingredients, which can be one of 10 things, according to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Why is this happening? Over time, food has become a commodity. It is a commodity to be economized and sold at high volume. They want to lower the production cost, stabilize shelf life so that it lasts longer, there's less waste, again, more economy. And they want you to buy as much of it as possible so they can increase sales. So milk becomes modified milk ingredients because it's cheaper. Real, actual sugar, like the old-fashioned stuff that comes from sugar cane, becomes high fructose corn syrup because it's cheaper. So we're getting all of these ingredient makeovers, and they say, oh, it's just the same. It's the same food that you've always had. It's no big deal. But it actually is a big deal. Not only as a consumer, because I want good quality food. Even if I'm eating my ice cream, I want it made from actual cream. But it changes the way our body responds to what we eat in terms of whether or not we feel full, whether or not our blood sugars respond appropriately. So we need to be thinking a lot more about food quality than we ever have before. So should you hear my talk today and you're like, okay, well, I've got to stop eating all this processed foods. I'm going to eat a lot more natural food. You could find that you'd be getting a lot more nutrition. But even some of our modern foods apparently may have lower nutrient quality than they used to just 50, 60 years ago. There was research that was published from the University of Texas looking at what they called common garden crops between 1950 and 1999. And a common garden crop is something like broccoli or tomatoes or carrots. And what they found is that between 1950 and 1999, there were actually some nutrients that were lower in modern foods. There's calcium, iron, protein, phosphorus, and riboflavin, which is a B vitamin. And so the theory that usually explains this is one of dilution. So the idea that we want bigger, more beautiful broccoli than we used to have. And yet there's only a certain amount of building blocks. You know, there's the same amount of calcium for the little broccoli as there is for the big broccoli, so that bite for bite, you're getting less, which sounds reasonable. So you just need to eat more broccoli, which I certainly wouldn't complain about as a dietitian. There's also another theory that's been posited for this, one that in choosing seeds for agriculture, we might choose our seeds for hardiness or yield or suitability to our climate. And unwittingly, we might have selected seeds that were less nutritious. A really good example of this is the rose. When I was growing up, my grandmother had these amazing rose bushes. And I always had to be very careful because I loved to pick roses for the house, but of course there were thorns and I hated getting stung. Well, apparently most consumers hate getting stung as well, because if you go to a flower shop nowadays and buy a dozen roses, they don't have any thorns. But what else do modern roses tend not to have? Smell. So in deselecting a trait we no longer wanted, thorns, we also unwittingly deselected for a trait that we did desire, which is scent. The same could be happening with our food. We're not really sure. But I actually want to give another theory on why this might occur. And one is the use of pesticides, which has become far more intensive now than it ever has been. And the reason why pesticides can be a good answer or a good theory in this result is that pesticides, and most of our most common pesticides, are what we call mineral chelators. That means they absorb the minerals from the soil so that they're not available to the other living organisms that might need them. And most of them chelate what are called divalent cations, which is a fancy scientific term for minerals like calcium and iron, two of the minerals that were lower. The other thing that mineral chelators tend to hold on to is nitrogen. And they kill those wonderful, beautiful bacteria that live in the soil that fix nitrogen. And nitrogen is used in plants for protein, which was another one of the nutrients that were lower in modern foods. So this is an interesting theory. We don't actually know why this is occurring. It is still much more important for you to be eating broccoli than Lucky Charms, even if the the minerals are 10% lower. You're still getting a far more nutritious food. But something else that's very interesting in terms of our use of pesticides nowadays is that we know, and there's some researchers in Spain doing some very interesting work on phytochemicals. So all those fancy antioxidants and phytochemicals we hear about in the news, they are really the plant's immune system. So when we put pesticides and herbicides on plants, they no longer have this need to self-protect. So that immune system doesn't have to be activated as much. And what we're finding is that in organics, there's actually pretty good research starting to emerge now that a lot of organic crops have more of these very exciting antioxidants and phytochemicals than conventional crops. So that will be really interesting to see the research as it comes in the next 10 years or so. How am I doing? There we go. So if you look around any mall or restaurant or workplace, we know that we're getting larger as a society. And today what I'm talking about is really how the way our food has changed has contributed to this. And I think it's important to realize that this is not an aesthetic issue. We can be healthy at most sizes. And health is most important. It's not important to just lose 10 or 20 pounds because you think you look better. It's really about what's metabolically going on when you have a great deal of excess weight. And weight is a concern, not just for aesthetics, but because obesity is actually a primary risk factor for most of the chronic diseases that we're facing as a society nowadays. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. Obesity is actually changing the way our metabolisms function to favor the development of these chronic diseases in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So what's actually happening? Why is this happening in our body? Time was, we thought of fat cells as very passive. They were kind of just like little storage sacks. We ate too much, we had extra energy, we put it in our storage sacks, and then it just waited there for a time where we actually needed to release the extra energy. But what we've actually learned in the last 10, 15 years of research is that human fat cells are in fact very metabolically active, which makes sense. If you have a living cell in the body, it would make sense that it was doing something to ensure that it stayed alive. And what it's doing is constantly sending messages throughout our system. And one of the messages that obesity sends and these very full fat cells send is one of inflammation. Who's heard of that term inflammation before? Anyone? Good. Usually when we think of inflammation, we think of something like arthritis, right? Whenever we see that suffix itis, that means inflammation of. So we used to think of inflammation as more of if you have a sports injury or if you have arthritis. But what we've learned over time is that just like stress, we have acute stress when you're trying to run away in an alley from an attacker versus that chronic stress of having too much on your plate at work, too many commitments, trying to run, Johnny to soccer practice and piano lessons and Susie to her swimming lessons and get dinner on the table. That kind of chronic stress can actually break the body down. We've learned that the same thing is true with inflammation. So you can have that inflammation from a sports injury or with arthritis, but you can also have this subacute, this chronic everyday level of inflammation that does the same thing, that breaks the body down. Obesity, particularly around the middle, that belly fat, that hard belly fat, sends those inflammatory messages. And actually under the microscope, you can see that type of belly fat actually has a lot of macrophages around it. Macrophages are a white blood cell that are implicated in the inflammatory response. So we know that those fat cells are actually sending that inflammation message. And why is that important? Because inflammation is actually an independent risk factor for all those chronic diseases as well. So the second message that all of that excess fat is sending is one that it doesn't want to get any fatter. It's like, I'm done, I'm full. I don't want any more. And so particularly around the belly, a lot of excess weight causes insulin resistance. Everyone's heard that term, insulin resistance? Right. So what that means is that when we eat something that has carbohydrates, our blood sugar rises slowly or quickly, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when blood sugars rise, our pancreas senses it and says, okay, I'm going to send out some insulin. There's blood sugars. I need to make sure that gets into the cells. So the pancreas shoots out a little insulin, and you can think of insulin as a key that unlocks the door to the cells so it can welcome the sugar in and then does all the things it needs to with that sugar, like create energy for that cell. If your cells don't respond to that insulin, that blood sugar just roams around and around in your blood, wreaking havoc when your cells are screaming out for energy. So you want to make sure that you don't get insulin resistance over time. Another key in the metabolics of obesity is that a lot of environmental toxins and hormones are actually fat soluble. So vitamin D, which is a nutrient that we all need more of, is fat soluble. And in fact, if you have an excess amount of weight, your fat cells actually sequester that vitamin D from your system so that it's not available to do its good work. Estrogen, a hormone for women, is also very fat soluble. So women with excess body fat tend to have excess estrogen in their system, which is a risk factor for estrogen receptor breast cancers. And then finally, all of that extra weight is just a pain to carry around. It's harder on your knees, it's harder on your heart to pump all of that extra blood through the body, and it's harder for your lungs to ensure that your tissues are oxygenated. So how did we get there? Everyone hates carbs nowadays, but there is actually some truth to it. So processed carbohydrate is largely to blame. Somewhere in the early 1990s, we decided fat was to blame. And so we said, oh, easy, make everything fat-free cookies, fat-free ice cream, fat-free chips, fat-free everything. And then we've gotten larger as a society. One of the biggest reasons is that they're very, very easy to overeat. I like chips. Like the dietitian, I'm like, ooh, I like ice cream, I like chips. But I do, I like potato chips. And so have you ever noticed that you can sit down to a really big bowl of potato chips and eat the whole thing and not notice? And even worse, feel hungry 30 minutes later? It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Why is that? Because there is nothing in that food to tell your body it's full. There's no fiber, which would take up room in your stomach, activate those stretch receptors, which would tell your brain, hey, I've had enough food to eat. There's not a whole lot of nutrition in that food for your cells to actually get the nourishment they need. And it just tastes so good. It was engineered with that magic blend of salt and fat that says, you know what, I just need more. You know, the reason why they say you can't eat just one is because you really can't eat just one. So that's a huge reason why processed carbohydrates are so to blame, because it's easy to eat 1,000 calories in a single sitting and not even feel full. It's not that we've become more gluttonous as a society, it's that we're eating all of these very processed, calorically dense foods that do nothing for us. So how do they affect your body once you've overeaten those 1,000 calories of potato chips or ice cream or candy? So I had just said that when you eat these foods, your blood sugars rise. Well, when we eat foods that are generally made from flour and sugar, an assortment of those sorts of ingredients, your blood sugars actually rise very sharply. You want them to rise nice and slowly, but they actually rise really quickly. When you have a big rise in blood sugars, your pancreas actually shoots out insulin in proportion to that rise. So a big blood sugar rise means a big rise in insulin, means a lot of doors on the cells opening. They take in the sugar and it plummets. So when you have a nice big bowl of Lucky Charms for breakfast, you feel full and happy and satisfied for about 10 minutes. And by the time you get to work, you're starving because the blood sugar rose really fast. It tanked. And because it tanked so dramatically, your body went, I'm starving. I need more sugar. I need it fast. I need it really fast because my blood sugar dropped really fast. What do? You crave more of the same. That's when the big 600-calorie bran muffin looks really good an hour later. That's how they lead to overeating. It can also contribute to things if you get really owly when that happens. It's usually the carbs. More cravings, more inflammation. Too much sugar running through your blood can lead to inflammation. Triglycerides, if anyone gets their blood fat panels, I hope everyone over the age of 35 here does, do cholesterol, but there's also something in there called triglycerides. And it was counterintuitive when I learned this in school. Triglycerides, even though it's a blood fat, is actually a better marker of how your blood sugar control is than being related to the fat that you eat. And then, of course, stress on cells. If you do that every once in a while, a bowl of Lucky Charms every once in a while, no big deal. But if you're Lucky Charming every single day for 10 years, your pancreas starts to get a bit annoyed. And so do your cells. And then they eventually go, you know what, I'm done. I'm tired of all this aggravation. I'm just not going to listen to the insulin anymore. Not going to do it. And that's how we get diabetes. So what's next in terms of how our bodies got the way they are? Another food stuff that I would say has a massive impact on our health, particularly in terms of inflammation, is the quality of fats and oils that we eat. Not the quantity. I'm not a fan of low-fat, fat-free everything. Fats have an important role to play in our health, but the quality really matters. So when I talked about a great leap forward in terms of food processing, the trans fats were the huge. That's the worst of the worst. Don't ever eat them. Hawkins cheesies, tons of trans fats, sorry to say. Trans fats are the ones you want to avoid at all costs because they're highly inflammatory. There is no nutritional value whatsoever. They raise your bad cholesterol, and even worse, they lower your good cholesterol. Just terrible. That's the worst. Now we have new margarines that don't have the trans fats. They figured out how to do it without the trans fats. It's a little bit better. They're not always made from great quality oils. They're made from more that corn and that soy, some of the cheap safflowers or cheap canolas that actually are very pro-inflammatory as well. They're just not the best quality of oils to run our system on. And then finally, some fats that we want to eat a little bit less of as well are the animal-based saturated fats. So that's the butter and the cheese and the 32-ounce steak. Really? Deep fried in beer. I did not. I'm a vegetarian. I ate at the hotel in Savannah. There was nothing. Even the greens, I was so excited for all these southern greens. They're stewed for hours with a massive ham hock in them. I was like, yeah, there's a reason why Paula Deen got diabetes. I'm sorry to say. So how do these cheaply processed fats alter your body chemistry? So because they are a fat, in excess, added fats, because they're rich in calories at 9 calories per gram versus 4 for a carbohydrate or a protein, they will promote weight gain if they're abused. But the poor quality fats, they raise your blood cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart disease. You want to keep your cholesterol as low as possible. And so the cheap, processed, more industrial fats will promote higher cholesterol. And then surprisingly, they will also promote insulin resistance, which again, we saw the sugars affecting blood fats. The type of fats that you eat also affect the way your body processes sugars, which is really surprising to most people. And then, of course, poor quality oils further stoke the fires of inflammation in your body. So, what is the ultimate experience of processed carbohydrates and poor quality fats? The value meal. And we've become this nation of, stressed out, overfed, value meal drive-thruers. And we're normally getting like our drive-through dinner on the way from sitting at the office all day to sitting at home in front of the television. When we absolutely do not need all of this excess energy, that's when we reach for it the most. And so one of the biggest challenges for fast food is that it's all the stuff you don't want and none of the stuff that you do. There's no fresh produce. There's little fresh food whatsoever when you're having a fast food meal. I mean, we're lucky in BC. We've got some great, healthy, quick options, but for most places, that's not the case. And even the seemingly healthier options at fast food, like that salad, which is, chicken and some chow mein noodles with all the cheese and the creamy dressing that actually has more calories and fat than a double cheeseburger, or the oatmeal that seems, because oatmeal is really, really healthy. Somehow, when you buy oatmeal at a fast food restaurant, it has more sugar than a small glass of Coke. they just figure out how to make that food so darn tasty so you keep coming back for it. And even if you eat at more of a sit-down restaurant, sit-down chain restaurant, you might think you're getting better quality food, when the reality is you're actually simply paying more because someone's serving you at your table. I actually know, and he'd be mortified if I told you this, so I'm going to keep it anonymous. I know someone who owns a branch of a very popular Canadian sit-down restaurant everywhere, not just in BC, but there's branches of this all across Canada. And when we were talking, he was really shocked because he had owned it for a little while, sold it, and then bought it back. And when he bought it back, what he noticed is that they weren't actually making any of the food anymore. The hard-boiled eggs for the salad come in hard-boiled. The chicken breasts that they serve you for an entree come in cooked, fully cooked. He's so excited because one of the changes he's making is to make the line cooks actually cook the chicken from scratch again. A lot of the food in chain restaurants comes in already pre-packaged, pre-seasoned, with all the kind of stuff that you don't want on it to make it taste better because it's not fresh. And they need all that excess salt and sugar because if it was just fresh, good food, it would taste amazing on its own. So something to watch when you are choosing your chain restaurants as well. And so, of course, the way we live today, I mean, our bodies, if we didn't have the propensity to eat rich food when it was in front of us and store that energy when we had excess, we wouldn't have survived all these thousands and thousands of years. But we just don't simply live in that world anymore. So we're less active than ever before and have this amazing abundance of tasty, cheap calories. Not nutritious food, but tasty, cheap calories to keep us eating and eating and eating. So it's a challenge because we are living in a world that is promoting us to sit on the couch, play with our computer, and eat food as we're doing it. And so it takes a lot of willpower to actually break that cycle, and that's where the education comes in. So finally, as I mentioned that I would share with you a little bit of information about the information that we consume that leads to us consuming certain foods. And I like the problem with science. There's no problem with science. But the problem with science is that the world we live in and the media that we consume, now more so than ever before, is instantly responsive. It is constantly generating content. I work with the media quite a bit, and I always love it when I get a call at 10:30 in the morning, and they say, here's this study that just came out. I'm going to send it to you right now. Can you be ready by noon? Oh, well, I could use a little bit of extra time. No. If we don't get this online by noon, it's old news. How can you do good journalism? How can you actually, thoroughly inspect something and put it against the decades of studies that came before it when you have an hour and a half to post your story? And this is the information that we're consuming. We want to create a hook. Media is a business, just like all others. They want to create a hook. They want to create a headline like, red wine is good for your heart. You want to learn more about that? So you buy the paper or you tune in at 6 o'clock. Next week, red wine isn't so good for your heart. Really? I just bought all that case of red wine. So now you're going to tune in, learn a little bit more, know if you have to give that case to your friend or save it for a party or if you can actually drink it. Science, on the other hand, is slow, as it should be. You have an idea. Is red wine good for your heart? A lot of the countries that drink a lot of red wine seem to get less heart disease. So I'm going to study that. I'm going to put my proposal together. I'm going to apply for the grant. I'm going to go through the ethics committee. I'm going to study people for 5 years. I'm going to analyze all that research. And then I'm going to hopefully get it published. And then someone else does it. And then someone else does it. And then someone else does it. And 10 years later we go, most of us agree, red wine's good for your heart. How do you do that on Twitter? It doesn't work. So what we have at odds is this very slow, consensus-building knowledge base and the headlines being splayed about daily without actually thinking about what's going on here. And that's how we all get confused. That's how we as consumers get confused. Sometimes that's how I as a dietitian get confused. And so I want to share with you some of our long-standing nutrition beliefs that are actually getting called into question. The first, and the devastating. We have always, as health professionals said, you know what? Saturated fat is bad for your heart. Eat less of it. Less butter, less cheese, fewer 32-ounce beer-coated steaks, and you're going to be healthier. And then in 2010, researchers from the Harvard School of Public Health, which have got to be one of the most esteemed public health teams in the entire world, put out a review that said, oops. What? Oops? Apparently, if you review all of the literature that's been done linking saturated fat to heart disease, the correlation is not that strong. So for the first time, they put a chink in that armor and left us wondering, what do we do now? What do I do now as a dietitian? What do I tell you? Here's what I tell you. Context is everything. Please raise your hand if you have a tub of something at home called saturated fat. No one, although you might. You might, I don't know. I have MCT oil at home, who knows? So, think about this as rational beings instead of scientists. What if one of you loves butter? You love butter, you eat it every day. You also run marathons, and you also use that butter to slather huge piles of greens, which you also eat every day, aside your beautiful chicken breast and your bowl of fruit for dessert. Or maybe someone else in this room never eats saturated fat. They have really wonderful fat-free cereal, which they drink with their, fat-free almond milk, and then they eat fat-free granola bars for their break. And then you have a low-fat iceberg lettuce salad at lunch. Which one do you think is healthier? We eat food, not nutrients. So the challenge with research is that in order to do good research, we need a tightly defined, narrow question. Not food and heart disease, saturated fat and heart disease. And even though in the research, there are ways of controlling for certain variables, like fruit and vegetable intake, it's really hard to put the human diet into a series of binary code in a computer and hope that we're going to come out on top. Another one really just hurts the dietitian in me. So calcium is good for your bones. Take more calcium, especially us women. We're at risk for osteoporosis. Take more calcium. Just take more, just take more, just take more. And then a few studies came out that said, well, you know what? Maybe that's not so good for your heart. Maybe all of these calcium supplements are actually leading to the arteries around our heart becoming calcified and leading to heart disease. What do we do? There's already a little bit of research that says, no, forget about it. Those other studies were wrong. So we find ourselves in this confusion. What do I do? Do I take my calcium supplements? Do I not? Calcium is interesting for me because as a dietitian, I know it's really easy to get all the calcium you need from food. All you need, if you drink milk, 3 glasses of milk a day. You swap one for a yogurt, swap one for a cheese, swap one for a cottage cheese. That's all you need. And yet most of us, for our bones, feel that we need to take a supplement on top of the food. And whenever we extract something from a natural food, concentrate it, take it out of the context of that food, we can't always be sure how it's going to affect our bodies. And so more is more, which is such a tightly and beloved dictum in our world, is usually not the case with supplements. So as a dietitian, what I tell my clients here is get it from food. If there is some reason why you cannot, take a little bit of a supplement. A little bit is better than more. Don't take 1,000 milligrams. Don't take 1,500 milligrams, please. Food first. And then you can let the scientists quibble for the next 10 years because they will. And you know you're safe. This one is a favorite one in January, around the time of year where we are all desperately trying to be on a diet. So what most dietitians like myself and other health professionals will say every time the rash of fad diet comes out, it doesn't matter what you do, calories in versus calories out, and that's how you lose weight. You take fewer calories in, you spend more calories, that's how you lose weight. Fad diets don't work. Although, what we've seen is that it actually does matter which foods that you choose. And when you think about this, just like my chip example, if you eat a pound of chips or a pound of French fries versus a pound of broccoli, that matters. Not only are the chips and the potatoes going to have way more calories and fat than the broccoli will, but it's not going to fill you up. Might raise those blood sugars really quickly so that 30 minutes later you're going to want a little bit more potato. And there's no nutrition. There's no nutrition that your body and your cells are actually craving to do all the things that they need to do in a day. So food choice matters. And in fact, some research that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year showed that French fries and potato chips are the two foods most associated with weight gain over time. So I've switched to popcorn. So in that same study, what they found is that foods that were not associated with weight gain over time, fruits, vegetables, nuts. So for all you who might think, oh, well, if French fries and potato chips have a lot of calories and fruits and vegetables don't, that makes sense. But nuts have a lot of calories, but they're also very nutritious. They're also very filling, and they are not associated with weight gain over time. And what I like about this study is that it's not focusing on saturated fat or sodium or sugar. It's focusing on the food and the food choices that you make. So that if you make better food choices, you don't have to worry so much about all that other stuff. Just eat good food, and the rest of it's going to take care of itself. And then finally, this one is not based in any sort of science whatsoever, so neither is my argument. In nutrition, we have all of these wonderful statements that seem so simple. They're deceptively simple. Eat a variety of food, or just take in fewer calories than you burn, or eat everything in moderation. There's no good or bad foods. Well, I am going to boldly tell you today there actually are bad foods. A double bacon cheeseburger is a bad food. Full stop. Kale is a really, really good food. Once you can say that to yourself, you then can slot those foods into their appropriate place in your diet. I live by something called the 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time, I eat really, really, really good food. Lots of fruit, lots of vegetables, lots of beans, lots of nuts, lots of unprocessed grains like brown rice and quinoa. And 20% of the time, I have my wavy lays. And I don't worry about it because I know I got all of that nutrition that's going to help me clean up the rest. The challenge is when your 80% looks like KFC and ham and cheese on white with a slap of mayo. You're getting the ratio wrong. So when you know there's great foods and not great foods, you then can fit them in. It's not about never having a double bacon cheeseburger again. It's knowing that's your 20% and making that 80% look so good that you can deal with it. So I want to close with just some really basic rules that everyone can use to eat a little bit better. First thing, eat at home. Even if you don't think you know how to boil water, it's cheaper, it's healthier, and will probably take less time. You think, if you call Pan and Go Pizza, it's usually 35 to 45 minutes. You can boil some water, make some whole wheat pasta, throw on a chicken breast and put some nice jarred tomato sauce without a lot of extra salt in it. That is a healthier and more satisfying meal than the pizza, which by the time it gets to you, it's cold anyways, and it's not that exciting. Avoid the unidentified carb. This is those beautiful looking muffins that stare at you when you go to get a cup of coffee that somehow have 600 calories in them and 30 grams of fat. And that's the bran muffin. Take it from me, if you're going to have the muffin, don't worry about the bran. There's other things in there that you don't want. So, but this is also where we need to rethink our snacks. We actually take in more of our calories through snack foods than we do from real food nowadays. So these are the Frappuccinos and the granola bars and the 100-calorie snack packs, because who's satisfied with just 100-calorie snack pack? These are foods that are inherently processed, lacking in nutrition, totally overeatable. How many are there? 6 in those little 100-calorie snack pack boxes? That's a 600-calorie snack pack right there. Don't kid yourself. So we want to eat real food. Take the opportunity at snack time to actually eat an apple or a pear. I was really excited to see pears at the snack table. But this is an opportunity to get more nutrition in. Real food doesn't come from a box or a bag, and snack time is really where we want to focus because many of us do not too badly at meals. We also need to eat a little bit less. So you need to reconnect with how much food you actually need, and eating real food that's actually filling helps you do that. It's not about being hungry all the time. When you eat real food, you can actually feel full and satisfied, but you won't take in as much energy as you would have otherwise. And then make that plate half vegetables. I mean, what is so great about vegetables after all? It's very, very boring to hear a dietitian up here saying, please eat your fruits and veggies. But there are so many reasons why this is, if you do no other thing, the most transformative habit you can build into your life is eating your full 4 cups for a woman or 5 cups for a man of produce a day. The reason why is that fruits and vegetables have all of the vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants that we see splashed all over those nutrition headlines. That's where they are, fruits and veggies. There were antioxidants in blueberries before scientists even knew what an antioxidant was. Nature is far wiser than a food manufacturer. So you want to get all of the nutrition that fruits and vegetables provide because it's your armor against the stress of daily life and chronic disease. In addition to having all of these nutrients, it's a great value for your calorie buck. You get all of this nutrition with very few calories. And fruits and vegetables have a lot of water and fiber in them, so you feel full. In fact, the easiest way to get healthier is that every time you look down at your plate, 50% of your plate should be fruits and vegetables. That's it. Doesn't matter if you're a meat, potatoes, veg kind of person, or you do a lot of mixed meals, stir fries and stews and casseroles. Simply increase the volume of produce to half of whatever recipe or dish you're making, and you will be healthier. You will also take in fewer calories and help stabilize your weight over time. Something so simple. And I like it because it's an additive behavior. It's not about not having pizza or ice cream again. It's about choosing to add a positive habit. So just some final thoughts. Really, so many of you already know what you need to do to be healthier. And sometimes I'm glad I have my job because I love my job, but sometimes it challenges me to think that we need dietitians in our world because we have so many mixed messages and we are so confused about what to eat. All you need to know is that if it looks on your plate pretty much to how it grew or was raised in nature, it's a good food. Real food will protect your health, and processed and packaged foods will likely harm it. So have an apple, have a little bit of chicken, and don't worry about the rest of it.